Hey there friends, today I want to talk about what doubts you might experience when you're a PhD student. Now I think it's quite normal to doubt yourself, doubt the situation, doubt what you're doing at some point during your PhD, and I certainly did. And this is even when things are going, let's say, relatively well, so I don't mean what happens when adverse situations come your way or personal conflicts or whatever. I just want to talk about the doubts that may grow in you as you're doing your PhD, even though when things are going relatively well. And having these doubts, I think, is quite normal because a PhD really does test your limits in a number of ways. In terms of, can I learn this technique? Do I have the capacity to understand this particular statistical method? How do I navigate the personal relationships in the lab or with cooperators or the scientific community? How do I present things? How do I write? So I think there's plenty of challenges, so it's normal that you will experience doubt at some point. In this video, I want to focus on three kinds of doubts that may pop up and have certainly for me, and I think they are quite common. And they are: am I smart enough? Am I doing something that's sufficiently important? And am I really doing the work that suits me best and where I can perform the best? So let's talk about these three things. First of all, am I smart enough? Now, I think this is definitely probably one of the most common things, most common doubts that people will encounter, because inevitably during your PhD journey, you will see some extremely intelligent people. And this can be quite intimidating, because when you compare yourself in particular departments with somebody else, you may easily find that they far exceed your abilities in whatever field it may be. But what is important to remember is that while a certain level of intelligence certainly is important to finish your PhD, and without that you would likely not have been admitted into a PhD program in the first place. So I think you can safely assume you have that basic level of intelligence. So while it's important to have a certain level of intelligence, however you define it, it certainly isn't everything. Because I've certainly seen some very intelligent people that are probably way more intelligent than myself, not do quite as well, not perform quite as well as you would expect given their intellectual abilities, or even fail. And that is for a whole number of reasons. Maybe they have very poor interpersonal skills or communication skills. Maybe they question themselves too much and get too hung up in self-doubt, or because they're not willing to put in the work that's inevitably required for a PhD, because they think maybe things just fall to them, or maybe they're too easily discouraged by setbacks that will inevitably appear during your PhD as well. And the list goes on. There is quite a number of ingredients, if you will, that contribute to making your PhD a success. And intelligence is one of them for sure. But I'm not even sure it's the most important one. At least that's what I've been telling myself. Now, moving on to the second one, am I doing something that's important enough, that really is worth putting in all this time and effort? Now, this will inevitably come up, I think. And the reason this comes up, at least speaking from my own experience, is that you got into that particular field, let's say ecology or ecosystem ecology or community ecology or whatever it is that you're doing out there, because you were fascinated by the big questions in that field. Like, what's the role of biodiversity, or how does biodiversity come about? And these are the questions that made you interested and made you want to pursue a PhD in that particular field. So now the reality is, when you're doing a PhD, you are generally not working on these big questions, right? Because no one person can, but you are working on a probably relatively small subset of that question. And that relatively small subset of that big question that got you excited in the first place can feel not as significant, because in the end it isn't, right? It is just the subset of the big question. But that is quite normal, right? I mean, you cannot expect that during your PhD you're going to solve major questions. I mean, you might, but it's pretty unrealistic. And so you may feel like what you're doing in your PhD is relatively insignificant, because it's just a subset of the big question that you find fascinating. But the mental trick to overcome that problem is that with everything that you do, you need to at least make that mental connection for yourself in whatever way that this contributes to that solving that bigger question. Because this is your journey. You're not going to probably get there during your PhD. You have a whole number of decades ahead of you if you're continuing to do research to really get there. But most likely you're not going to get there during your PhD. But to avoid feeling that what you're doing is not important, is not significant, is not a big chunk, you need to make that mental connection with the bigger question. That was certainly very important for me. Well, and the third one, am I doing the work that suits me best? That's a difficult one, right? Because you may not really know what suits you best. You may only discover that during your PhD. You might actually discover that at some point towards the end of your PhD even. Maybe you realize that you are really good at statistics, or really good at modeling, or really good at identifying species and putting them into categories, or whatever it is in your particular field. You may only discover that as you try things out. And so that is a really tough one. Is this PhD optimal for my abilities? And the answer to that one is, it doesn't really matter. Because if it is what you're doing, if it is really what you're best at, fine. And you will discover as you try out other things that really they are not as exciting to you as what you're already doing. Then it's great. If you during your PhD journey discover that you're actually better at something else, congratulations. This is the best that can happen, because the best that can happen to you is if you find something that you're really excited about. And if it happens during your PhD, fantastic. If you still have time during your PhD, and if your project allows that kind of flexibility basically to accommodate that interest that you've just discovered, go for it. Talk to your advisor. See if you can incorporate more, let's say, modeling or more taxonomy. If it is towards the end of your PhD, or if your project is not flexible enough because of the funding, then still, congratulations, you can take it on to the next stage. It doesn't end with a PhD. A PhD is a particular target. You get that degree, and then you do something else with that degree. And so for your postdoc, for example, you can then choose to dive more into that passion that you have discovered during your PhD. So I think to address that third point is, don't worry too much about it, but do try out different things, right? Because you're only going to find out what you're particularly good at if you try out different things, like talk to collaborators, talk to lab mates that do other things, go to workshops, and expose yourself to some techniques, questions, theories, questions, whatever it is, and then you may discover what really suits you best. So those were my three big ones, and there's plenty other sources of doubt during your PhD and adverse influences. And if you have some others you would like to see a video about, just let me know in the comments. And with that, thanks very much for watching. Good luck with your PhD. See you in the next video. Bye.